A noble girl, I faith. Heart. I think I fight with a familiar, or the ghost of a fencer. Call you this an amorous visage? Here's blood that would have served me these 7 years, in broken heads and cut fingers, and now it runs out altogether doth Middleton. Roaring girl. Prince John sat down impatiently before Arlingford Castle in the hope of starving out the besieged, but finding the duration of their supplies extend itself in an equal ratio with the prolongation of his hope, he made vigorous preparations for carrying the place by storm. He constructed an immense machine on wheels, which, being advanced to the edge of the moat, would lower a temporary bridge, of which one end would rest on the bank, and the other on the battlements, and which, being well furnished with stepping boards, would enable his men to ascend the inclined plane with speed and facility. Matilda received intimation of this design by the usual friendly channel of a blunt arrow, which must either have been sent from some secret friend in the prince's camp, or from some vigorous archer beyond it. The latter will not appear improbable, when we consider that Robin Hood and Little John could shoot 2 English miles and an inch point blank. Cum scrive terpino, che non era. The machine was completed, and the ensuing morning fixed for the assault. 6 men, relieved at intervals, kept watch over it during the night. Prince John retired to sleep, congratulating himself in the expectation that another day would place the fair culprit at his princely mercy. His anticipations mingled with the visions of his slumber, and he dreamed of wounds and drums, and sacking and firing the castle, and bearing off in his arms the beautiful prize through the midst of fire and smoke. In the height of this imaginary turmoil, he awoke, and conceived for a few moments that certain sounds which rang in his ears were the continuation of those of his dream, in that sort of half-consciousness between sleeping and waking, when reality and fantasy meet and mingle in dim and confused resemblance. He was, however, very soon fully awake to the fact of his guards calling on him to arm, which he did in haste, and beheld the machine in flames, and a furious conflict raging around it. He hurried to the spot, and found that his camp had been suddenly assailed from one side by a party of foresters, and that the baron's people had made a sortie on the other, and that they had killed the guards, and set fire to the machine, before the rest of the camp could come to the assistance of their fellows. The night was in itself intensely dark, and the firelight shed around it a vivid and unnatural radiance. On one side, the crimson light quivered by its own agitation on the waveless moat, and on the bastions and buttresses of the castle, and their shadows lay in massy blackness on the illuminated walls. On the other, it shone upon the woods, streaming far within among the open trunks, or resting on the closer foliage. The circumference of darkness bounded the scene on all sides, and in the center raged the war, shields, helmets, and bucklers gleaming and glittering as they rang and clashed against each other, plumes confusedly tossing in the crimson light, and the messy light and shade that fell on the faces of the combatants, giving additional energy to their ferocious expression. John, drawing nearer to the scene of action, observed 2 young warriors fighting side by side, one of whom wore the habit of a forester, the other that of a retainer of Arlingford. He looked intently on them both. Their position towards the fire favored the scrutiny, and the hawk's eye of love very speedily discovered that the latter was the fair Matilda. The forester he did not know, but he had sufficient tact to discern that his success would be very much facilitated by separating her from this companion, above all others. He therefore formed a party of men into a wedge, only taking especial care not to be the point of it himself, and drove it between them with so much precision, that they were in a moment far asunder. "Lady Matilda," said John, "yield yourself my prisoner." "If you would wear me, Prince," said Matilda, "you must win me," and without giving him time to deliberate on the courtesy of fighting with the lady of his love, she raised her sword in the air, and lowered it on his head with an impetus that would have gone nigh to fathom even that extraordinary depth of brain which always by divine grace furnishes the interior of a head royal, if he had not very dexterously parried the blow. Prince John wished to disarm and take captive, not in any way to wound or injure, least of all to kill, his fair opponent. Matilda was only intent to get rid of her antagonist at any rate. The edge of her weapon painted his complexion with streaks of very unloverlike crimson, and she would probably have marred John's hand forever signing Magna Carta, but that he was backed by the advantage of numbers, and that her sword broke short on the boss of his buckler. John was following up his advantage to make a captive of the lady, when he was suddenly felled to the earth by an unseen antagonist. Some of his men picked him carefully up, and conveyed him to his tent, stunned and stupefied. When he recovered, he found Harpenden diligently assisting in his recovery, more in the fear of losing his place than in that of losing his master. The prince's first inquiry was for the prisoner he had been on the point of taking at the moment when his habeas corpus was so unseasonably suspended. He was told that his people had been on the point of securing the said prisoner, when the devil suddenly appeared among them in the likeness of a tall friar, having his grey frock cinctured with a sword belt, and his crown, which whether it were shaven or no they could not see, surmounted with a helmet, and flourishing an 8-foot staff, with which he laid about him to the right and to the left, knocking down the prince and his men as if they had been so many 9 pins. In fine, he had rescued the prisoner, and made a clear passage through friend and foe, and in conjunction with a chosen party of archers, had covered the retreat of the baron's men and the foresters, who had all gone off in a body towards Sherwood Forest. Harpenden suggested that it would be desirable to sack the castle, and volunteered to lead the van on the occasion, as the defenders were withdrawn, and the exploit seemed to promise much profit and little danger. John considered that the castle would in itself be a great acquisition to him, as a stronghold in furtherance of his design on his brother's throne, and was determining to take possession with the first light of morning, when he had the mortification to see the castle burst into flames in several places at once. A piteous cry was heard from within, and while the prince was proclaiming a reward to anyone who would enter into the burning pile, and elucidate the mystery of the doleful voice, forth waddled the little fat friar in an agony of fear, out of the fire into the frying pan, for he was instantly taken into custody and carried before Prince John, wringing his hands and tearing his hair. "Are you the friar," said Prince John, in a terrible voice, "that laid me prostrate in battle, mowed down my men like grass, rescued my captive, and covered the retreat of my enemies? And, not content with this, have you now set fire to the castle in which I intended to take up my royal quarters?" The little friar quaked like a jelly. He fell on his knees, and attempted to speak, but in his eagerness to vindicate himself from this accumulation of alarming charges, he knew not where to begin. His ideas rolled round upon each other like the radii of a wheel. The words he desired to utter, instead of issuing, as it were, in a right line from his lips, seemed to conglobate themselves into a sphere turning on its own axis in his throat. After several ineffectual efforts, his utterance totally failed him, and he remained gasping, with his mouth open, his lips quivering, his hands clasped together, and the whites of his eyes turned up towards the prince with an expression most ruefully imploring. "Are you that friar?" repeated the prince. Several of the bystanders declared that he was not that friar. The little friar, encouraged by this patronage, found his voice, and pleaded for mercy. The prince questioned him closely concerning the burning of the castle. The little friar declared that he had been in too great fear during the siege to know much of what was going forward, except that he had been conscious during the last few days of a lamentable deficiency of provisions, and had been present that very morning at the broaching of the last butt of sack. Harpenden groaned in sympathy. The little friar added that he knew nothing of what had passed since till he heard the flames roaring at his elbow. "Take him away, Harpenden," said the prince, "fill him with sack, and turn him out." "Never mind the sack," said the little friar, "turn me out at once." "A sad chance," said Harpenden, "to be turned out without sack." But what Harpenden thought a sad chance the little friar thought a merry one, and went bounding like a fat buck towards the abbey of Rubygill. An arrow, with a letter attached to it, was shot into the camp, and carried to the prince. The contents were these: "Prince John, I do not consider myself to have resisted lawful authority in defending my castle against you, seeing that you are at present in a state of active rebellion against your liege sovereign Richard, and if my provisions had not failed me, I would have maintained it till doomsday. As it is, I have so well disposed my combustibles that it shall not serve you as a stronghold in your rebellion. If you hunt in the chases of Nottinghamshire, you may catch other game than my daughter. Both she and I are content to be houseless for a time, in the reflection that we have deserved your enmity, and the friendship of Coeur de Lion. Fitzwater.